Good morning and welcome to the 2020 Williamson County Caregiver Conference. My name is Rob Fabian. I am from Age of Central Texas. We are so very happy to be your host once again for this 7th annual conference. Now, obviously this year things are a little different for us, so we're going virtual this year. And since this is kind of a new territory for us, please be patient with us in case we have a few little technical hiccups. But we have an amazing week of presentations with experts from all over the United States here. And today, of course, we have an amazing keynote with Dr. Barry Jacobs. If you were part of our Striking a Balance conference a couple years ago, you got to see Barry and his wife do our presentations at our keynote. He is an amazing expert, and we are so excited that he was available to come and join us this year to do our keynote for this year's conference. Before we get started this morning, I've got a quick video I want to show you. We have an introduction from our executive director at Age of Central Texas to welcome you to the conference, along with a very short video from our presenting sponsor, who is Baylor Scott & White Health.
Hi all, my name is Suzanne Anderson. I am the Executive Director of Age of Central Texas. Welcome to the Williamson County Caregiver Conference. We are so very glad that you're with us today. I know that you're not used to attending conferences virtually, so it's sort of a new experience for us all. But I wanted to make sure that you knew that Age continues to be committed to providing needed information and resources and support to caregivers, and certainly during this very, very challenging time. So we appreciate your participation and hope you enjoy the day. Thank you again.
At Baylor Scott & White Health, there's nothing more important to us than your well-being. Over the last several weeks, we've done a number of modifications to our emergency room so you can continue to get the care you need when you need it. We're regularly cleaning and disinfecting frequently touched surfaces in our lobbies and patient areas. When you arrive, a screener will check your temperature, and we're requiring everyone to wear masks. When it comes to registration, we've got a no-touch process. You'll just answer a few simple questions. We'll get you back to our room as quickly as possible. We want you to be well informed and not ignore symptoms that could indicate a potentially serious condition. In those situations, it's critical you don't delay. To learn more about all we're doing to help keep you safe, visit bswhealth.com/safecare.
All right. Before we get started with Barry's presentation, got just a few little housekeeping issues I want to go over real quick. Number one, we are recording these sessions, and so if you have any technical issues, if you get knocked off, if your internet goes down at your home, don't worry. We're going to be posting all of these sessions on YouTube, and we will send you those links so that you'll have that available. You can watch it at any time. You can share it with friends or family, and you can go back and take a look again at all the information that's being presented. Number two, when you got your email reminder about today's session, you also had a couple of links that were included in that email. One was the program for our conference. Be sure and take a look at that because it has a lot of great information, including bios for all of our presenters and information from our sponsors for this year. You also got a link to caregiver resources. We pulled together some great resources just for you of information and things that are available here right in the Central Texas area. So be sure and take a look at that as well. Finally, we want you to use your chat feature today. You look right down here on your screen, you have a chat bubble. It looks like one of those voice bubbles from the comic strips. So click on that and it'll open up your chat box. We want you to ask questions today because that's why we do these seminars. It is so we can give you all of the information, all the resources you need for your journey as a caregiver, wherever you are in your journey. So as Barry's doing his presentation today, he's going to ask you to participate and ask you some questions. So be sure to use that chat feature. But if you have questions that you would like to have answered, be sure and ask those questions because at the end of the session, we're going to have a Q&A with Barry. And so we will answer your questions. Now, because we have a little bit of limited time today, we might not be able to get to everybody's question. However, we're going to answer your question. If we're not able to get to it live today, someone from Age of Central Texas is going to contact you directly, and we're going to answer your question. So be sure and ask those questions. Also, at the end of this week, you're going to get a follow-up email. And in that email is going to be a link to a survey. Surveys are very important for us for the caregiver conferences because it tells us what you need and the sessions that you want. So please be sure and fill out the survey because I guarantee you we read every single one of them. And we use your responses to plan next year's conference. All right, so it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Barry Jacobs with us today. As I mentioned, Barry has been our keynote speaker once before for our Striking Balance conference. And if you know anything about Barry, he is just an amazing presenter. He's a clinical psychologist, he's a family therapist, and he's a principal in the Philadelphia office of Health Management Associates, which is a national healthcare consulting firm. He was a journalist for many years, and he's an author. He has written the books Emotional Survival Guide for Caregivers, which was published in 2006. And he's the co-author of AARP's Meditation for Caregivers book, and just released another book entitled Love and Meaning After 50. And if you follow AARP online, you have definitely seen Barry's columns. He is the monthly self-help columnist for family caregivers at aarp.org. He is also a national spokesperson for family caregiving for the American Heart Association and an honorary board member for the Well Spouse Association. Barry, thank you so very much. We appreciate you being with us again this morning, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rob. Really my pleasure to be here. Thank you as well, Natalie, for helping with the technical details. And thank you, as always, to Age of Central Texas for having me. My relationship with Age of Central Texas actually goes back about a decade or more. And I've been a keynote several times. And I always love coming to Austin and come to Central Texas. So really glad to be here with you today. I only wish I could be there in person to see you, but we'll make do. So let me open up my my PowerPoint, and we'll take a look at what I have in mind for us today. And as you heard Rob say, I'm going to be asking you some questions, and we're going to be making use of the chat box. And I am really interested in hearing kind of a little bit about your situation and some of the questions that you may have. But as you can see, the title today is Promoting Positive Caregiving, Even in Tough Times. And I think certainly these have been tough times of late. And I know for family caregivers, going through this pandemic, it has meant all kinds of changes, including, unfortunately, the closing of a lot of the support services, like adult daycare programs that caregivers rely upon. So we'll talk very specifically about that. So let me show you more specifically what I have in mind for us. What I'd like to do is paint a picture for you of what family caregiving in America looks like. I want to talk a little bit about what the research says about both the negative and positive effects of family caregivers on family caregiving on caregivers. And then what you're going to hear me say again and again is caregiving brings strains and gains, and that our role, our job in caring for ourselves is to figure out a way to minimize the strains and to maximize the gains. And I'll go even further to say that if we're able to maximize the gains of caregiving, with the so-called positive rewards of caregiving, it'll actually help us deal with all the challenges that we face on a daily basis. And then I'm going to give you some general ideas of how we can minimize those strains and maximize those gains. And then we'll talk very specifically about the challenges of COVID. So I hope that's what you have in mind for this presentation. So now before we get going, I have a question for you, and I want you to use the chat box for this. So in the chat box, I would be delighted if you would put in a little, just two things. What is your relationship, or let me say this differently. Who is the person that you're caring for? Is it a parent, a spouse, a child, a friend, or other? So that's the first question. And then the second question is, what is the person you're caring for's condition? Do they have dementia? Do they have cancer? Do they have MS? Do they have Parkinson's disease? So if you can go ahead, it would just kind of give me an idea of who I'm speaking with today. You can just go ahead and put some of those answers, and I'm just going to take a look at them and say, Dewana says parent and brother. So Dewana, you are caring for multiple people. Miriam says partner, frontal temporal dementia, which we'll actually talk about that a little later, FTD. Friend, cancer, husband, 2 types of dementia. Donna says, I care for my 80-year-old husband. Any other samples here? Both parents, multiple physical and mental health issues. Okay. Caregiving in a volunteer capacity, Huntington's disease, 2 parents in 2 locations, consultant to caregivers. Nice to meet you, Ed. Iorna says, 88-year-old father, good health but forgetful. Okay, so what I'm seeing here, and this is what I suspected, is that probably most folks are caring for parents. I do see like Sylvia's caring for a spouse, that many of you are dealing with different types of dementia, whether, as Josephine writes, vascular dementia, or frontal temporal dementia, or probably most commonly, Alzheimer's type dementia. Some folks are caring for grandparents, and many of you are caring for multiple people. So that's helpful for information to inform my presentation, and I actually, what it also lets me know is I'm coming in right on target by and large with the kinds of issues that I think come up with these challenges. Okay, so let me start with a personal story. All right, and with some of my own family photos. So this is a photograph of my dad when he graduated from college in 1942, and he's at a dance with my grandmother. And if you can see the expression on my grandmother's face, she's glowing, because my dad was her oldest son. He was by far her favorite child. And throughout my dad's life, my grandmother really doted on him excessively, and was very possessive of him. So that, you know, even though in 1942, in June of 1942, my dad went into the Air Force to fight in World War II, and actually left home for about 3.5 years. When he came back, he moved back into his parents' house for probably the next next 12 years, and allowed my grandmother to wait on him hand and foot while he went to law school and started working. But my dad was very much under my grandmother's wing that whole time. My dad was very much a mama's boy. And then here is a photograph from my parents' wedding in 1957, and my dad is finally getting his act together and moving out of the house. And, you know, there's my mom in a lovely white taffeta dress on the right. And there's my dad in the snazzy white tuxedo on the left. And there's my grandmother in between them, which is actually where my grandmother liked to be in my parents' marriage. So my grandmother competed with my mom for my dad's attention and his affection. And I would say that these 2 strong-willed women kind of got along. They sort of tolerated one another, would be, you know, about the best they got along. My grandmother was very domineering and intrusive. My mother kind of put up with her, and they sort of dealt with one another the best they could. Until when I was 14 years old and my dad was 51 years old, my dad contracted brain cancer. And at that point, and one of those first symptoms with brain cancer was that he was unable to speak. He had what's called aphasia. So he couldn't express his own wishes when it came to what type of medical care he was going to receive. And so that meant my mother, his spouse, you know, his legal guardian, was going to be making the medical decisions for him about where he was going to be treated and what kind of treatments he was going to receive. But my grandmother felt that she ought to be making these decisions because she loved my dad more. She was his emotional guardian in a way. And so she and my mother began to argue over everything they could possibly argue about my dad's treatment. And then my grandmother read about an experimental treatment for brain cancer out in California and wanted my mother to sell our home in New York to move the family to California to give my dad the best chance of surviving. And my mom, like most of us, had multiple family roles. She was a wife to her husband, but she was also an adult child to her own aging parents who lived nearby, and she wanted to be close to them. And she was a mother to her own 2 teenage sons, and those sons, myself included, did not want to move. And so my mother said to my grandmother, no, she wouldn't sell our house. And essentially, my grandmother never forgave her. And then when my dad died a year after he was first diagnosed with brain cancer, my grandmother blamed my mother for his death because she didn't move the family out to California. And then my mother and grandmother saw each other at my father's funeral and then did not see each other or speak again for the next 17 years until the day that I got married. So I share this story by way of saying, you know, family crises, medical crises, sometimes can bring family members closer together. They rally together to help a loved one, but it also has the potential for driving a wedge between family members and causing a schism that lasts for decades, as happened in my family. And so in my, you know, I grew up to become a psychologist, and a psychologist focusing primarily on working with family caregivers. And so in my work, I try to help families do a better job of handling these crises than my own family did. So that's why I'm here speaking with you today. So then if you live long enough, you have not just one family caregiving experience, but you have multiple family caregiving experiences. As actually we saw when we looked in the chat box, there are a number of you who are having multiple family caregiving experiences right now. So my mom went on and got remarried to a nice guy named Steve, and they had a very nice marriage for about 30 years and retired to Florida and were living the good life on the golf course. My stepfather was playing golf 3 times a week until he developed Alzheimer's dementia. And then my mother was really struggling to take care of him because she herself was becoming more physically frail. And so my wife and I moved them up from Florida to live near our home in Pennsylvania in 2010. And then we became very involved in helping my mom care for my stepfather. And unfortunately, after about a year, his dementia was so bad that he went into a nursing home. And then I would drive my mom to the nursing home 3 times a week, maybe sometimes more often around lunchtime. And my mother would, what she would do was basically spoon feed my stepfather lunch as often as she could. And if she could get him to finish the plate of what to me looked like not very appetizing food, it looks like soggy zucchini today, then she would leave the nursing home feeling really upbeat, really happy that she had made some small difference. And this made a great impression on me because you know, this dementia can be such a depressing illness, and the nursing home was such a depressing place. And yet the fact that my mother could make some difference, provide her husband with some comfort, meant an enormous amount to her. And that really touched me a great deal. And then unfortunately, my stepfather died after being in the nursing home for 2 years. My mother became increasingly frail, and we had to hire home health aides for her. And here she is with the home health aide who was with her for a long time, and it was a wonderful friend to her, a woman named Mary. And then unfortunately, my mother in 2015 had a series of falls and broken bones and hospitalizations. And then as a consequence of that, she went into a nursing home. So here she is, and there I am, trying to do my best to care for her while she was in the nursing home. And I wasn't spoon feeding her as she had spoon fed her husband, but I did my best. And then after being in the nursing home for about 1.5 years, my mom died about 3 years ago. So I share these stories with you, not because they're unusual stories, but because they're increasingly common stories. So as you know, many of you probably realize, more and more Americans are becoming family caregivers as our population is aging and more older adults need care. So right now, according to the 2020 Caregiving in the United States report that was put out by the National Alliance for Caregiving and AARP, one of our sponsors today, 53 million caregivers spend some time each year providing care for an ill or aging loved one. And that could be, someone living with someone who needs care and providing round-the-clock care, or it could be just someone going over once a week with a bag of groceries and mowing the lawn, or, changing light bulbs or balancing the checkbook. I mean, caregivers can have very basic roles, or can have very intense roles. So in 2015, the last time the Caregiving in the US report was done, it found that 18% of Americans at that time were caregivers. And now in 2020, we're up to 21%. So essentially 1 in 5 Americans are getting some taste of this experience. And that's, again, due directly to the fact that more Americans are living older, and also because people are living longer with the kinds of health conditions like residual effects from a stroke or dementia, or even living longer with cancer than they might have 30 years ago. But they're not living longer whole and self-sufficient. They're living longer with the kind of functional deficits for which they need care, and that care is coming from family members primarily. The breakdown between men and women caregivers is actually 60% women, 40% men. When I was showed this slide about 20 years ago, it was 70-30, women to men. So us men are stepping up a little bit. And because I'm a baby boomer, I had assumed that all caregivers are baby boomers, but that in fact is not true. About a quarter of all family caregivers are millennials, essentially people in their 20s and early 30s, my kids' age, caring for parents or grandparents, or they're the generation just above the millennials, the Generation Xers. So this is affecting many, many different Americans at different ages and different walks of life. But if you take the 53 million Americans that are caregivers now and you boil them down to one average family caregiver, it would be a 49-year-old woman who's been caring for her mom for at least 4 years, and she still works at least part-time, as well as caring for a younger generation, whether her own children, who may be teenagers now, or caring for grandchildren. And this is the so-called classic sandwich generation caregiver. She's caring for the generation above her, she's caring for a generation below her, and she's being squeezed by the demands of those two generations and feeling very stressed. And it wouldn't surprise me if some of you today fit that sandwich generation description. When most people get involved in caregiving, they're not really sure what this is going to entail. They basically sign up for this saying, I need to help my mom, I need to help my dad, I need to help my spouse, without realizing all the different roles this is going to entail. So I'm not going to go over every single role here, but just to touch on a few. I mean, obviously caregivers are very important companions and supports for their loved ones. They're the drivers taking care recipients back and forth to doctor's offices and to physical therapy gyms. They're often the point person between the healthcare system and the rest of the family. So the caregiver goes to the doctor's office with their loved one, listens to what the doctor says, maybe takes notes, then has to share that information with the rest of the family, try to take what sometimes is very technical information that the doctor is providing and make it understandable to the rest of the family, which means the caregiver herself has to understand that information. By the same token, the caregiver understands the care receiver in a way that the doctor never will, and has to help the doctor understand the patient's personality, their deficits, their behavior at home. And so that caregiver winds up playing what I call a technical interpreter role, going back and forth between the healthcare system and the larger family system. At the same time, caregivers wind up playing what I would call a case management role, and that is sharing information from one healthcare provider to another. So for example, when I used to go to the doctor's office with my stepfather, oftentimes I found that The primary care doctor may not have known that how the cardiologist had changed his medicines, or may not know that how the neurologist had given him new instructions or even a new diagnosis. And so I would then be sharing the information with one doctor that another doctor had said. Even though they were all on the same electronic medical record, it doesn't mean that they were all reading each other's notes or really were aware of what each other were doing. So there's a lot of fragmentation in healthcare, and oftentimes it's the caregiver that has to take all different fragments and put them together somehow. Some other data from that, from that 2020 Caregiving in the United States study. 21% of the folks that were surveyed, the caregivers who were surveyed, said that their health was fair or poor, which is alarming, because if you compare that to the U.S. population as a whole, when you ask just average Americans how their health is, 12% of them say their health is fair or poor. So that suggests that caregivers are reporting more health issues than non-caregivers. And then when you compare the 2020 statistic of 21% to 2015, which was 17%, you can see that more caregivers are reporting more health issues. Just general rules of thumb here about who are the caregivers that seem to have the toughest time. There are three categories I'm just going to mention. This doesn't exclude other caregivers and the stress they have, but here are the three that strike me as being the most stressed caregivers. So number one are spousal caregivers. And these are folks who have higher rates of depression than adult children who are caregivers. And they're oftentimes older, they're doing more hands-on caregiving, more heavy-duty caregiving than adult children. And so these are also the folks who, because of the fact that the relationship with the care recipient is different than an adult child's relationship. Their whole life is wrapped up in this person who's their lifetime partner, and all their hopes and dreams for the future are wrapped up in this person. And if that person is having, say, dementia, then the well spouse's life is dramatically affected. Another stressed group of caregivers are military caregivers, and these are the folks caring for our wounded warriors coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, many of whom may have traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress disorder or amputations or all of the above. And these are often younger women or parents caring for some of these very impaired wounded warriors and really struggling, despite the fact that the VA has a very robust family caregiver support program. And then the third type of stress caregiver I just want to mention are dementia caregivers. I mean, I'm sure that's not a surprise to you. And as you saw earlier in the chat box, many of us are caring for loved ones with dementia. And dementia caregiving is considered really the toughest kind of caregiving for many reasons, not the least of which is because someone you really love is declining before your eyes. And this is also a type of caregiving that tends to go on for years and years because folks with dementia tend to decline rather slowly. So to give you an illustration of this, I want to read you a quote. So as Rob mentioned earlier, for many years now, I've been writing a monthly self-help column on the AARP website where I talk about different topics. And then oftentimes, readers will post comments beneath my column. And so one day I saw that someone had posted a comment beneath one of my columns, and it was this, and there was this comment, and I just want to read it to you. This is from the wife of a woman caring for a husband with Alzheimer's disease. And what she wrote is, I don't think anyone can understand the intense, crushing isolation and loneliness of caregiving unless they have walked a mile in our shoes. I miss the intimacy we've had for more than 50 years, and I'm not talking about physical intimacy, although I miss that too. I miss having someone to talk to or share a chuckle or one of our little inside jokes. It's all gone. I'm not ready to ditch my marriage vows and dash out and have an affair, but I long to have a companion again, even someone to just stand and hold me while I cry the tears I've had to squelch and swallow for so long. So I think this is an incredibly articulate description of the way an Alzheimer's caregiver, an Alzheimer's spousal caregiver feels. And it has so much sadness in it, but really I think captures the way many Alzheimer's caregivers feel about seeing their loved ones, someone that they've relied on, someone they've shared life with for many, many years, but seeing that person essentially just disappearing and missing the relationship they had with that person, and feeling that their own needs are not being well met now. So I just wanted to share that with you because it was so moving to me. I just want to kind of wrap up this section of our presentation, and then I'm going to ask you to put some things in the chat box. I want to offer you just a little bit of research. And so the gentleman on the left is a famous dementia caregiving researcher by the name of Rich Schultz, who's a social psychologist at the University of Pittsburgh. And Dr. Schultz in the late 1990s and early 2000s did a lot of research on dementia caregivers, as well as dementia spousal caregivers. And he had a very famous article in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1999, which found that dementia caregiving was associated with a whole cascade of health effects. So dementia caregivers had high rates of insomnia, literally from getting up in the middle of the night, listening for whether their loved one was walking around the house or not, or might be wandering trying to wander out into the community. These caregivers often had high rates of depression, and they also had bad neck and back pain, literally from helping their loved ones in and out of bed, up and down the stairs, on and off the commode, in and out of the car. And that because these dementia caregivers were so focused on caring for their loved ones with dementia, they weren't taking care of their own health concerns. So these dementia caregivers had their own diabetes or their own high blood pressure. They then consequently did not fare well with these illnesses, and they actually died at a higher rate as same-age peers with the same chronic illnesses who were not caregivers. So, Dr. Schultz painted what was a really kind of almost dire perspective on family caregivers, and that they, essentially that they die sooner than non-caregivers. The gentleman on the right is an epidemiologist at Johns Hopkins University named David Roth, who has come out with more recent research in the last 5 to 10 years, which actually refutes a lot of what Dr. Schultz had. And Dr. Roth has found that he finds that caregivers don't die sooner, that they actually live longer than non-caregivers. He believes they live 16% longer. And the reason he thinks that caregivers live longer is because he thinks that people who are caregivers have a positive reward of caregiving, and that is they have an enhanced sense of purpose. They wake up every day feeling like what they do matters tremendously because they have to care for someone who is really relying on them. And so that enhanced sense of purpose helps these caregivers live longer. So I can't tell you how we can reconcile Dr. Schultz and Dr. Roth's research. They don't fit together very well, other than to say that caregivers, when you're talking about 53 million people, we're talking about a lot of people, many of whom have, a broad range. I would say among that group, there's a very broad range of types of people, types of caregiving, and types of reaction to caregiving that those caregivers have. Some may really suffer, as Dr. Schultz points out. Some may really thrive, as Dr. Roth points out. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. The gentleman here is Dr. David Kuhn. He's a research psychologist at Arizona State University, and he also writes, at least wrote in the past, a lot about the positive rewards of caregiving. And I like this quote he has on this slide very much, because I think it nicely sums up what some of the potential positive rewards of caregiving could be for a caregiver. And Dr. Kuhn wrote, "The majority of caregivers readily endorse caregiving gains or positive aspects of caregiving, including having the opportunity to serve as a role model, having the chance to give back to care recipients, experiencing an enhanced sense of purpose, feeling appreciated, and helping to maintain the identity and well-being of the family." So like I said, I like this summation of some of the positive rewards very much. I also just want to underscore this idea of the opportunity to serve as a role model, because I can tell you that after my wife and I moved my mother and stepfather up from Florida to live in Pennsylvania near us, that we were very aware that our kids, our teenage children, were observing us and keeping their eyes on us and making, and we were teaching them about family values by doing this caregiving in a way that just talking about family values would never have gotten across. So I'm hoping that they learn that lesson, and one day when their mother and I need care, they'll step up and care for us. I'm only half joking there, by the way. So let me just finish up this part of the presentation by saying, as I said right at the beginning, caregiving brings strains and gains. For many people, it brings a combination of things that are really hard and that are really straining, the things that are really rewarding, and from which people feel that they get a sense of gain. And the question for all of us is, how do we minimize the strains? How do we maximize the gains to make caregiving a more positive experience for all of us? And that's what we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about. But before I do, I would like to ask you to put something in the chat box, and that is, could you put in just a couple words? What is has this been a strain for you? What has been, or I should say, what has been a strain? And maybe, are there gains that you found in caregiving? So if you could go ahead and put that in the chat box and hit enter now, I'll start reading some of the replies. What has your experience been? What have your strains and what have your gains been? And if you don't have any gains, that's okay. You can just put the strains in. Or for that matter, if you don't have any strains and it's just all gains, that's fine too. But I'd love to see some of your comments. And I still see Bruce had a comment up here from being a long distance caregiver to two parents. And I appreciate that, Bruce. Michelle writes, gain, closer walk with Jesus. So Michelle, it sounds like this has had important religious, brought you closer to doing God's work in this world. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Regina says, glad to hear the research acknowledging the rewards. Absolutely, there's a lot of research about the rewards now, because it's not all dire. Holly writes, strains, caregiving from a distance, especially during COVID. Holly, you are absolutely correct. I mean, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk COVID in a little while, but the difficulties of providing care for someone from a distance, having to talk with them on the phone or using FaceTime or something like that, has been extremely difficult when you have a loved one in a nursing home that you can't visit. We'll talk a lot about that. Iorna writes, my privacy, dad lives with me, I'm a widow, dad is a widower. And I'm assuming that you mean here, Iona, that this is that this is a strain, that you have a loss of privacy as a result of dad living with you. Holly writes, for gains, getting to know my parents better as an adult. Absolutely, Holly. And I'll just say that, with my mother and stepfather, I hadn't lived in the same city with them for about 30 years prior to our moving them up from Florida to Pennsylvania. And it was, it was a big adjustment. We had to really get to know one another as people all over again. Because my mother's, for instance, just something simple. My mother remembered me as a kid loving chocolate ice cream. And as I had grown and evolved in my taste, I didn't like chocolate ice cream anymore. I loved vanilla ice cream. So something as simple as that, we had to kind of get to know one another again. Michelle has strain, argumentative, distrusting. Okay, and we can talk a little bit about that, Michelle. That's a very hard situation. R. Walton, the strains of balancing full-time employment, marriage, child under 5 years old, and creating self-care habits, gain, working from home. Okay, thank you. Michelle also writes strain, constantly facing criticism. Michelle, that I have written about that for AARP, about feeling blamed all the time, feeling criticized. That's an awful feeling. Jessica writes, strain, still being mothered at 50 years old can be tiresome to hold one's tongue, becomes more and more difficult. I hear you. And it's sometimes very hard at 50 years old. And I think I started providing care for my mom. I was 52 years old. To have them, checking, my mother telling me how I should be doing things all the time. It didn't please me. Pastor Suzette, strains, sandwich generation. During high activity, I'm worn out and I groan to the sound of my phone ringing. Frustration, communication, especially with distance. Maria, I'm a long distance caregiver and support my siblings who are primary caregivers. I've learned a lot from research and the need for teamwork. Really well said, Maria, that I agree with that. Margaret, Lipscomb, like helping others, sometimes emotionally and mentally tired. Okay, there's the strains and the gains right there. Iorna, yes, a strain. I'm going to just read a couple more before we go on. It looks like there are lots more here to read. Strains, Razel, spouse fights me all the time due to FTD. Boy, that is tough. And I will tell you, folks with FTD or many folks with any kind of dementia don't have good judgment. And so you're doing all you can to help them, and they're telling you that they don't need help and that they're fine and get out of their lives. And boy, is that frustrating. It's like getting, you're making all these sacrifices on their behalf and they're kicking you in the teeth. And I faced some of that with my mom too. Bruce K, strain, not being able to physically visit my parents, gain, making more frequent phone calls to stay in touch. Great. I'm just going to read one or two more. McAllister, I am lucky that my loving mother is still in my life. Her smile is my gain. My strain is that my mother's illness has taken her independence and she is angry about it. It is hard to balance sometimes. I hear you. There's a lot of joy there in what you just wrote, and there's also a lot of sadness in what you just wrote. So I thank you for all these comments, and we could probably spend the rest of the time just sharing strains and gains. But maybe we'll come back to this later, but I do want to give you some thoughts about how do we minimize the strains and maximize the gains. So let's kind of get into that. So I have up here 6 ideas that I've developed over the years that I believe help us minimize the gains and maximize, minimize the strains and maximize the gains. And I'm not going to go into every one of them, but I'd like to go into a number of them in some depth. But here you'll get the slide deck and you see these. So the first one is going to almost like a little bit of a paradox, especially for all of you who've taken the time to be on this caregiver conference call today. But not everybody who's a caregiver believes that it's a good idea to care for themselves. They think that somehow they're not allowed to care for themselves. So, what I talk about with folks, almost every caregiver I see, is I use the old cliche of caregiving is not a sprint, caregiving is a marathon. And this is especially true for a long course of caregiving, such as caregiving someone who has dementia. I mean, on average, people who are diagnosed with dementia will live another 7 to 8 years, and that means their caregivers are going to be doing care for a long time. So this is almost with dementia, this is almost never a sprint. It's almost always a marathon. And that's true for Parkinson's disease. That could be true for cancer. If someone has recurrent bouts of cancer, it's true for MS, many of the types of diseases that loved ones are caring for now. So I take this metaphor and I stretch it as far as I can possibly stretch it. So, and I don't know if any of you are marathoners, but here's the way I think. So if you run a marathon, you do not run it the way you would run a sprint. So one of the things that you need to do when you run a marathon to successfully get from the beginning of the race to the end of the race is you got to learn a little bit about the course of the race. You got to learn where the uphill sections are, where the downhill sections are, so to help prepare yourself. Some people talk about walking the course or driving the course to get a feel for this. And to me, this is like the caregiver who has to learn about their loved one's condition. What's likely to happen over the course of time? What are the treatments going to be? What are the good and maybe side effects of the treatment? And how does a caregiver prepare themselves for what may be coming down the road? So that to me is part of running the marathon. Obviously we got to live in the, in the day, we got to live in the present, but we also need to know a little bit about what's going on. I'm just going to take a little sip of water. Okay. Second thing about marathoner is we need sustain have a sustainable pace. People who sprint, I mean, they put their arms and they pump their arms, they pump their legs, and they put their head down and they go as fast as they possibly can, expending all their energy. Well, that's a terrible way to run a marathon. You will never get from the beginning to the end. You will run out of steam long before the end comes. So we have to find a pace that's actually sustainable as a caregiver in the same way. You know, no marathoner runs past the water station at mile 5 when people are waving water bottles at them. And no marathoner says, no, thank you, I'm not thirsty, because that would be insane. No one would ever get to the end of the course if they're not taking water along the way. And yet that is what caregivers do. Many caregivers say, I'm not interested in help. I'm going to do this on my own. No, thank you. And that to me is not the smart and strategic way of running this race. It's not a smart and strategic way of being a caregiver. And finally, we know that caregivers, that marathoners run further, run better when they run alongside others, when they run in a pack, when they have people on the sidelines cheering for them, waving signs with their name on it. It really spurs them on. And I think this is true for caregivers too. When we have people who are in the same boat, who are also caregiving, who understand us, maybe people we've met through a caregiver support group, or maybe people we know from church who are caregivers, that this really helps carry us further. We don't feel so alone. So that's my rendition of the caregiving marathon metaphor. Just like I said, stretching it as far as I can. Part of the self-care here and part of the replenishment that people need to take is some of the things up here on the screen, some of the things that I'm sure many of you are doing already. And I'm going to ask in a little while, what are some things you're doing to take care of yourself? But, you know, we have people who make sure that they have protected time. They make sure they get respite. People who know that to do physical exercise is very important. People who know that praying and going to church or you know, having other spiritual practices are important to them. And those folks who are using some sort of mindfulness technique to help relax them, to help them achieve what's called non-reactive awareness of some of the difficulties that they're going through. So just another couple thoughts about mindfulness. So what, mindfulness is a word that gets kicked around a lot in our culture now. And it's not all about meditation. It's not all about kind of sitting cross-legged on the floor and breathing deeply. You know, mindfulness, as I said, is about finding ways for being aware, not less aware of what's going on in your life, but more aware of it, but reacting less to those things. And that takes a certain reflection, and it also takes practice reflecting. And so to me, mindfulness techniques include things like, as I mentioned, meditation, breathing exercises. It could be walking in nature and kind of getting a feeling for a kind of the greater universe, having an awareness of maybe God's work in this world, if you're someone of a religious bent. I think journaling is very helpful for developing a sense of reflection and mindfulness, kind of understand, getting some sense of what the caregiving is like in your life, not to kind of fill the journal with all kinds of complaints about how hard this is, but to reflect on maybe those strains and the gains that you're seeing as you go along. And so mindfulness is about being able to really reflect on the past, on the present, and as it says right in here at the bottom, to gain a larger perspective of things, and a larger perspective that this is a time-limit event in your life. It could go on for years. I provided care for my mom and my stepfather for about 7 years. It was a long stretch of time. I know it's now 3 years since then, and I look back on it, and I can tell you it was hard, but I also have a sense of gratitude about it. And that's the kind of awareness we want everybody to have. So before we go on, I would ask you to put in the chat box, and I'll read some of these. What are some of these things that you're doing to take care of yourself? What are some of the things that work for you? And granted, we don't, the same the same replenishing exercise is not going to be helpful for all of us. You know, we all have our ways, whether it be reading, whether it be physical exercise, whether it be hitting golf balls, whether it be talking with friends, or sitting silently. What helps you? And are you, and then my next question, you don't have to answer this now, but I'm always going to be interested in, if you know what's helping you, then are you actually doing those things now, or are you taking the time to do those things? So I see here, Jessica writes, at least 1 or 2 week away trips a year were my outlet, but now due to pandemic, no trips are to be had, so I meditate a lot. Okay, thank you, Jessica. And I'm really glad to hear you got some time away. I hope you can one day again. Miriam writes gardening. I can tell you, Miriam, so many people, I've never been known how much gardening people do, but it really seems to make a big difference in how people feel. Regina writes walk in nature, yoga, prayer, meditation. Next person here says arts and crafts, terrific. Iorna says it's hard with COVID, but I walk my dog. Also, it's been so hot, it's hard to get out. I hear you. These are challenges, but thank God we got to walk our dogs just to get a little physical exercise. Maria writes physical exercise, gardening, prayer. Sue writes, what helps me is teaching a storytelling class. Interesting that maybe it's the teaching or maybe it's the storytelling that goes along with the class that are helpful for you. Michelle, praise, music, prayer, walking the dog, coffee with spouse. That's a great one. Trying to take a day trip. Terrific. Iorna, fixing the house. Not my cup of tea, but I'm glad it's yours. Ed, long walks around midnight. Interesting, Ed. Sue, writing and recording my stories and taking care of my dog. Margaret, long walks, naps, gardening, play with pets, limit my work time. Heather, prayer and keeping in touch with family. Excellent. Ed, calm, quiet, no traffic. Natalie, recess and physical PE, physical education for my kids, with my kids' school. All terrific ideas. And thank you for sharing them with one another. Those are great ideas. I see one more, actually 2 more, which I'll take before we go on. Josephine, take pictures of clouds, sunsets, sunrises. I've been taking a lot of photos too. That's great. And Razel says playing games. So all wonderful ideas for how do we keep ourselves going? How do we have a little bit of fun? I mean, life can't all be drudgery. Even in the middle of caregiving, even in the middle of hard caregiving, we have to have some fun, because it's the fun and the connection with others that carries us forward. The second task I want to talk about is accepting negative and positive feelings. And let me tell you what I mean by this. So sometimes I hear caregivers ask me, is it okay if I don't always enjoy being a caregiver? Because unfortunately, they don't always enjoy being a caregiver. They often have very negative feelings about it. They feel trapped, they feel burdened, they feel exhausted, they feel misunderstood, they feel underappreciated. They have all kinds of mixed feelings about caregiving, including negative feelings. But they often then feel guilty about the negative feelings that they have. They feel like they're not supposed to feel strained. They're not supposed to feel burdened, because they're somehow supposed to be a good enough, loving family member that they shouldn't have any negative feelings. And then because they feel guilty about the negative feelings, they then double down here, and they work even harder. And they beat themselves up if they have any negative feelings at all. And they say, no, I'm going to just do what I'm supposed to do. And I'm going to be the good wife. I'm going to be the good daughter and get this done. So I think this makes folks who have difficulty tolerating the mixed feelings, the ambivalence, then that unfortunately becomes even more stressful, makes caregiving even more stressful. So what I tell them is that everybody has negative feelings, that it's normal to have and expectable to have negative feelings. And that I ask them to make a distinction in their minds between hating the caregiving task and loving the care recipient. You can love the person you're caring for and hate emptying their commode, or hate having to get them out of bed in the morning, or hate sitting at the breakfast table with them for 3 hours because they can't seem to get through their, eating their meal. You can hate all those things. You can hate how hard they are, but still love the person and still be committed to caring for them. And that part of this is also that when there are tasks that you hate, you are allowed to maybe not do them or to find other ways of getting them done. You know, for instance, if you hate, showering your loved one, then you are allowed, if you have the resources, to hire someone to come in and shower them, because this is a task that is just too onerous for you. But you want to make sure that your loved one is clean, so you're going to take care of that responsibility in a different way. So tolerating the ambivalence makes caregivers more flexible. All right. The third task I want to mention, and this is often the one that caregivers have the hardest time with, and that is defining your commitments to caregiving realistically. So sometimes I hear caregivers say things to me like, I feel I have to do this, but what's the right way to do it? How much should I do? And as if, sometimes people say, I'll do whatever it takes. And that to me is a kind of setup for being overwhelmed over time, because caregiving usually will, what happens is the amount of caregiving tasks there are usually grows and grows and grows as your loved one declines. And as I mentioned before with my mom, all of us have multiple family roles. We may be an adult child or a spouse to someone who needs our help, but we have other family roles that we have to attend to. So it becomes a question of taking stock, really looking at where we are in our own lives, where our families are in their lives, what needs our family members have. Also, what kind of resources we have, what kind of, what is our insurance? What are our financial resources? What supports can we afford? And to try to begin to figure out what can we commit to doing for our loved one, but also what can we commit to doing for other folks, and what can we commit to doing for ourselves? How do we begin to divvy up our energy and create a kind of balance that we can live with, so that we're not putting all of our time and energy in one person because we feel like we don't have a choice. And to do this divvying up, to find this balance in a very conscious way, and knowing that we have limitations. So along these lines, I will say, as a psychologist, I will say to caregivers right from the get-go, to normalize this for them. I say everyone has limits about what they are willing and able to do. What part of caregiving will be especially hard for you? What are your limits? So I'm telling them right out front that nobody is a Superman. Everybody has limits. Everybody has to make choices about what they are willing and able to do, and what they're not willing and able to do. And then I also reassure them that if they delegate some of the responsibilities to somebody else, it is not shirking their duties. That, just like I said with the example of finding someone to shower your loved one is still getting clean, except the only thing is that you're not getting in there with them, getting wet and struggling with them. Someone else is doing that. You are taking the responsibility of ensuring their well-being without shirking your duties at all in that instance, in my opinion. And that, as some people say, oh, no one can do this as well as I can do it. So I say that's probably true, but we have to make compromises here. We're not going to do it all. That we don't have to be the perfect caregiver. We have to be the good enough caregiver. We have to provide good enough caregiving. And that means if we set limits at times, then that's okay. Our loved ones are not going to suffer from it. So that's a second idea I wanted to share with you. I'll give you one other idea, and then we'll take another little bit of a break. And this one, I'm sure, is not going to be a surprise to any of you, and that is because we hear this constantly, how caregivers need to use the support that they have in their families, among in their communities, and with professionals. So utilizing support makes perfect sense, right? But I have seen many caregivers, and I don't want to pick on men so much, but I often see male spousal caregivers who will say things like, our family takes care of its own. Besides, no one can take care of her as well as I can. And that for them, if they were to accept help, accept even support from somebody else, it feels shameful to them. It feels disempowering to them. And I have to have a conversation with them where I'm trying to convince them that if they use the supports, they're going to run a better marathon and therefore fulfill the mission that they've set for themselves, going from the beginning to the end. And that it's not going to be disempowering for them. It's going to be empowering them to give care for as long as they choose to give care. That accepting helps is a way of doing this better, doing this longer, and being the kind of caregiver they want to be. So that's something we sometimes debate, but that I want people to use what supports are available to them. Another aspect of supports sometimes which people bring up is that the folks that they hoped that would be there for them have disappeared. And that is extremely painful for caregivers. So I've heard caregivers say, our friends don't come around anymore. My best friend who I thought would be there for me, she's disappeared. She's out having lunch with other people. I can't go and have lunch with her. She just kind of turned her back on me. And they're bitter about this. And then the question arises, who can they talk to? Who can I talk to? And to me, this is a very important question, because if the people that should be there for us are not there, then we are at risk of becoming isolated socially, and we can't allow that to happen. We have to find a way to increase our social support, because that's what increases our resilience. And that means we want to look to immediate family, extended family, and community members and professionals to help us. So let me pause there again, because I've been talking fast, and that's what happens, when you grow up in New York City like I did. But I want to just see what thoughts or comments you have at this point about the last few things we said. We talked about utilizing support. We talked about defining commitments. Anybody have any thoughts or questions about any of that? You can put that right in the chat box, and I'm just going to pause and take a little drink of water here. Okay, let's see what we got. Ed says, sprint versus marathon analogy applies to caregiving, but also to life in general. Yep, I agree, Ed. Any other thoughts or questions before we go on? Okay, I will forge ahead here. The next one is find positive meanings in the sacrifices that you are making. And here is where we're looking for the silver linings to these dark clouds. Here's where we are really trying to find things that are gratifying to us about caregiving. Because otherwise, if people only see the negative in caregiving, it's going to make caregiving much harder. So what the questions, the type of thing I'm asking, I would love to have caregivers consider on their own is, what's the purpose of this caregiving? And why am I making all these sacrifices of my time and energy for this person? And I think that for folks who don't have a sense of positive purpose, who feel like they're just trapped or they're obligated, or no one else will do this, which I've heard all those things a million times, those folks are usually more resentful and are at higher risk of burning out. So in my conversations with caregivers, one of the most important things I do is I ask them this question. I hear their story about why they provide care, and then I say, I think what you're doing for your loved one is a wonderful thing, and I want to help you do more of it for as long as you choose to do it. But let me ask you this question. Why do you do what you do for your loved one? And what I'm really looking for is, what are the values underlying the caregiver's choice to give care? Giving care, making those sacrifices is a matter of choice. People wake up every day and say, this is what I'm going to do for my loved one. I want folks to reflect on why they're doing it. What are the values underlying that choice? So to give you an example of that, I want to tell you a little bit about Karen, someone I worked with years ago. She was a 60-year-old woman caring for her 92-year-old father at that time, who had Alzheimer's disease. She was caring for him in her home. Her father had been living there for about 2 years. And I heard all about Karen's providing care for her father. And then I said, why do you do what you do for your father, Karen? And she told me this story. She said, shortly after I was pregnant, I left my husband. And then after the child was born, I decided I was going to go back with him, and my parents knew it wasn't going to work. My mother kept saying, "He'll go back and have another baby." And my father said to me, "You can always come home. I don't care if you have 10 babies, you can always come home." He left that door open for me, and I did just that. I went back and had another baby and came back with 2 babies. And I'll never forget that. I always knew I could go home. And with this story, what I think Karen was trying to communicate to me is that the reason that she was providing care for her father is that at a really crucial and difficult time in her life, when she had a violent first husband, her father was there for her and allowed her to leave that marriage so she could go on and have a much more successful second marriage. That her father always had the door open for her to help her no matter what. And so now that Karen is caring for her father with Alzheimer's disease, this is her opportunity to give back to him for some of the absolutely crucial things that he did for her. And that, to me, that the value of giving back is a very powerful value that I think has an impact, that is a motivation for many caregivers. Other types of things that come up when I ask this question is people will say that they're doing this because they're doing God's work in this world. This is part of a religious mission that they have, or that they feel this is a moral mission, that this is the right thing for a spouse or the right thing for an adult child to do. Or they have some other value that they want to share. And I always am very respectful and honor those values. Maria writes, Karen's story is an unconditional love story. And I think that's right, Maria, but I think it's an unconditional love story that comes about in the context of having been well loved by her father. If her father had not loved her so well, she may not have felt as motivated to provide care for him. Right in this instance, at this point in their lives, there's nothing she wouldn't do for him because there was nothing he wouldn't do for her. So let me go forward. One other question I like to ask caregivers, and that is, I'd like to ask them to make believe that it's the future and they're looking back on this time in their lives. So they're in the present, but they're projecting into the future, looking back on the present at a point in time when it's actually the past. The question I ask is, how do you think you look back at this time in your life 5 years from now? So one reason I do that is because on the daily basis, caregivers can feel enormous strain of all the things they have to do. But afterwards, when it's all over and they're looking back on the caregiving, they're able to see some of the positive rewards better. And I have to tell you, I've been asking this question, or another version of this question: what do you think will be important to you in the future about the choices you're making now? When I ask this question of caregivers, 99% of the time, what they say to me is that they project into the future, looking back at this time now, and that they're going to say to themselves, "This was hard, but I'm glad I did it because it ultimately was the right thing to do, and it was very rewarding." And so I'm reminding people that in the long course of time, that what they're going through, as hard as it is, will matter to them and be seen as a positive thing. And that too helps caregivers gain some greater sense of positive meaning of the caregiving. Margaret says, "I will be content to know I contributed to those in need as best I could." Margaret, that's a very powerful statement. Carolyn writes, "Looking back, I have no regrets in doing the best I could taking care of my mom." And Carolyn, that's what I want every caregiver to be able to say. I look back in time, it was not easy. I have no regrets because I know I did the best I can, even if it wasn't perfect, even if I made mistakes, even if I got irritable at times, even if I dropped the ball sometimes, I forgot things. The fact that I did the best I could, that I can pat myself in the back in the long run, is extremely important. So let me go forward. And let's talk specifically about COVID. And then I want us to leave us some time for some questions. because the pandemic has certainly made life much harder for family caregivers. I'm sure many of you have seen the research that's come out in the last month or two that caregivers are having greater depression, greater anxiety, more suicidal thoughts, unfortunately. But I have to also tell you that, put this in context, Americans in general are more depressed, are more anxious. Folks who have mental health disorders are having exacerbations of those mental health disorders. People with substance use problems are having greater problems. The pandemic has been an enormous stress for all Americans, including family caregivers. But let's look at three situations. So I still have I'm a consultant most of the time, but I still have a clinical psychotherapy practice a day and a half a week where I see lots of caregivers. And so these are some folks from my practice. So here's a 71-year-old woman who's a client of mine, whose husband has frontotemporal dementia. And then at the time that the pandemic hit, his adult daycare program, when he was going 3 or 4 days a week, it closed. So now he's home with her that whole time. And she previously had a home health aide coming in to get him up and dressed and groomed every morning, get ready to to go to the adult daycare program. But now she's afraid to bring those home health aides into the home for fear that they're going to bring the infection with her. So she's not bringing them into the home. So what's happened? She has decreased services. She's with her husband all the time now, 24 hours a day. And she feels very lonely because she's not being able to do some of the things that she was doing when her husband was at adult daycare. She was not having lunch with friends. She's not seeing her grandchildren, for instance. And because she feels lonely, she feels ashamed that she feels lonely because she's with her husband all the time. If she's with her husband all the time, she shouldn't feel ashamed. At least that's what she's telling herself. And that because she's now with him all the time, she's having a much clearer sense of the degree of his cognitive impairment. And that's causing her to feel more despair. So what I said to this woman is, number one, this is a really tough time, and that you need to cut yourself some slack. You need to lower your standards and expectations of yourself and not criticize yourself if you feel lonely. It's okay to feel lonely. Not surprisingly, we talked about the importance of self-care, and that she could even sit in the same room with him and he's watching TV, and she could put the earbuds in her ears, and she could read a book, and she could watch her own show. She could do something completely different, listen to a podcast. She could be physically present, but still being taking care of herself in a way. And that it's very important that she still finds some simple ways to connect with her husband, looking at old movies, looking at photo albums, eating an enjoyable meal that they've always enjoyed, and as well as some other ideas here. A second patient a client I want to share with you is a 34-year-old daughter whose mother has dementia and is in a nursing home, and that in that nursing home, quite a few of the residents have contracted COVID, and some of them have died. And so this is a daughter who feels tremendous guilt that she isn't there with her mother. She also feels tremendous guilt that she has decided not to take her mother out of the nursing home because she can't care for her mother at home. It's just too much for her to care for her mother and to care for her children. But she has all this guilt that she's in her mind, she's put her mother in harm's way. She has tremendous fear for her mother's life, and she has this growing sense of anger and helplessness. So what I said to her is, you too, ma'am, need to accept that this is an extraordinarily difficult time, that you have to accept the limits of what you can do, that you cannot change, and that the nursing home will not allow you to come in to see your mom. And those, as the Serenity Prayer says, we have to accept the things we cannot change. You want to use all the available technology that the nursing home makes available to your mom to have as much contact with her as you can. And that journaling right now might be very helpful, putting down your thoughts and feelings in the hope that someday you may actually be able to share what's in this journal with your mom. And that I remind her that our connections with loved ones are not necessarily in the room, though certainly it's better to be physically present with them than not, but that our connections with them are emotional. They're in our hearts, and that her connection with her mom and her mom's connection to her hasn't been lost because she can't see her mom. And the final case I'm going to share with you is in many parts of the country, including Central Texas. The state is opened up. And then a lot of caregivers have been trying to figure out, well, okay, now what's safe? Is it safe to go out again? So here is a 46-year-old man caring for a 77-year-old father who has Parkinson's disease, and he really is unsure what to do now that stay-at-home orders have been lifted in this area. He sees on TV, people flocking to the beach, people flocking to the parks, sitting in restaurants. Is it safe for him to do this and then come home and maybe, infect his dad, or is it safe for him to take his dad out? And so he doesn't want to put himself or his father at any risk, but his father is complaining. He wants to get out and he wants to see other family members. So my advice to him is, if you just depend on news reports, you're going to get just a broad range of opinions, that you really need to start with your dad's medical provider and start with what their advice is. And then really it's going to come down to how do you weigh the risks and the benefits, and that you can get the input of family members. Family members can be a sounding board, but you are the expert in this. You have the right to make the decision. And that if you make one decision, you decide to go out, and then you go out and it's not comfortable, you have the right to change your mind and decide that it doesn't feel safe enough to go back out in the world yet. So I just want to close and leave us time for questions with this final idea. As I said again and again, family caregiving brings strains and gains. We want to minimize the strains and maximize the gains, and that we really want to approach the challenges of caregiving with a lot of flexibility and a lot of determination, and we want to seek those positive rewards, things that may transform us in our own lives, make us feel that we've done the right thing, and make us, at the end of the day, feel like we're better people for this. So I want to thank you for your attention and turn this back to Rob so that he can just take some questions. I'll also just very briefly show you that I have 2 books here on family caregiving, and I'll just leave these up here. But you've got the floor, Rob.
Thank you so much, Barry. We so appreciate you sharing all of those great tips for us and all that wonderful information. We are going to show you a very quick video from one of our other sponsors, the Texas Senior Living Locators. Barry, give you a chance to catch your breath and share this information. And of course, I had it all queued up, and what happens? There it is. All right. And always best laid plans with technology. You get everything all set, and then it doesn't want to work for you. Tell you what, we're going to show that tomorrow instead. Let us go ahead and take some questions. This is your opportunity to ask questions, because we said at the beginning, this is for you. We want you to have every opportunity that you have to get your questions answered. Barry, while we're getting some questions, I want to ask you a question here. We talked about COVID and the pandemic, and we know that caregiving is already so hard. I'm caregiving for my parents along with my spouse, and you throw COVID in there, and suddenly everybody's worlds are turned upside down. Add to that all of the social unrest, all the political madness is going on. Now we've got fires burning out in California. We've got hurricanes coming into the Gulf. It seems like every time we open our eyes in the morning, something else is going wrong in our world. How, as human beings, do we cope with all of this so that we can continue in our caregiving journey without just pulling our hair out?
I mean, Rob, it sometimes seems that all we can do is but pull our hair out. And as you notice, I don't have very much hair left. So, but what I'll say to you is that I think that we want to be cognizant of some of the challenges in our world. We want to be aware of those things. And yet we still want to be able to derive enjoyment and positive rewards from the things in our lives that matter to us on a daily basis. So we still want to have that cup of coffee with a spouse, and we still want to have that walk in nature, and we still want to watch the sun shine in the morning, coming up over the horizon. And we want to cherish our loved ones. We want to cherish the lives that we have, because it's those small pleasures, it's those small, meaningful interactions that really carry us through tough times. Yeah,
I'm finding myself, I've always been a news junkie. I'm just having to disconnect myself. I give myself 10 minutes in the morning and that's it. And after that, no more, because otherwise that's just going to override my day.
Yeah, I mean, you can binge on the news 24 hours a day, and I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. I would suggest people set limits on that, and find ways of still being out in the world and not glued to your phone or your computer screen or your television.
Right. I'm like a lot of the folks here. My backyard never grew into my house, and so I just ripped out all the grass and turned it into one massive flower bed. So that is my escape, is going outside and working in that flower bed.
That's great.
Maria made a statement a little bit earlier that she says, it's hard on my mother to understand why her children are not able to visit with her. It's stressful to know she's anxious about this. For those of us who are caring for family members who have dementia, who don't quite understand what's going on with COVID and the precautions, and don't understand why we can't come to the senior living community to visit with them, or why we have to stay home and we can't go outside, are there any ways that we as caregivers can help our older adults, and particularly those who do have cognitive issues, to either understand or redirect them so that it makes it a little easier for us to get through this time?
A really tough question. So I'll share some thoughts. I mean, so, dementia is a blessing and a curse, right? So the blessing part of it is sometimes the loved ones that may be missing us. They're so forgetful that they don't remember that we're not there. Or even if we've been there 10 minutes ago, they can't distinguish between when we were there 10 minutes ago and when we were there 3 weeks ago. And so we always have to take that into account. And when they say, I haven't seen you in so long, we have to just keep in mind that some of this may reflect their deficits. I think we do want to make use of the technology. We want to make use of photographs. We want to be as present as we can in their lives. We want them to hear our voices. We can even make recordings, video or audio recordings that we can ask the nursing home to play for them. But so the worst nightmare for any caregiver, a loved one with dementia, is that the person forgets who we are. I mean, that's the most heartbreaking thing there is. And so we want to maintain their memory of us and be as present as we can, even at a time when we may be physically separated from them.
Yeah, I have a very good friend who is caring for his mother in his home, and she no longer recognizes him as her son. She just thinks that he's a nice man who helps her. And so it's hard for him, but he has to remember that, I have to live in her world of Alzheimer's and what she understands. I can't bring her back to mine. And so I have to go into Alzheimer's world every day, he says. Jessica says, I'm taking care of my mother and taking mom to a lot of doctor's appointments. And I choose to stay in my car and let her go in by herself because of fear of being exposed to COVID-19. Is this frowned upon by doctors who are allowing a caregiver into the exam room? And do you think doctor's office are a safe place to be at all right
now? Well, let me answer there are two different questions. So let me answer the second one first. So our doctor's office is safe right now. I mean, I think that question hinges entirely on how much infections within your given community and what precautions the doctor's office is taking. And I will tell you personally, I've been to the doctor, and I think, where I am, and we got hit by COVID pretty hard. I think things have been, doctors have taken the right steps. Everybody's all masked up. Everybody's socially distant. Take temperature. I mean, they're really taking what precautions they can. And then would doctors or doctors' office, staff at doctors' offices criticize you as a caregiver if you don't come into the exam room? It's interesting because I've actually seen the opposite question, and that is there are lots of doctors' offices that don't want caregivers to come in. They want the caregivers to wait in the car outside. And if the caregiver tries to get in, then they criticize the caregiver. I think it comes down to the fact that we have to do what's most comfortable for us. And we also have to comply with the rules that the office sets up. And that means if your loved one can have a productive conversation with the doctor, and you would feel safest being in the car, then that's really what you should do. You just may have to find another way of communicating with the doctor by email through the portal or phone call. But you want to have the input with the doctor, and also hear from the doctor what's going on. Maybe get a copy of the chart note from that day. But you're not required to be in the exam room.
Yeah, I know here in Texas, telemedicine has been used quite a lot, and it's not always possible to use that in every situation, but I know that that's something that has been used often as well.
Right.
Regina has a question, and this one is one I think a lot of people are dealing with these types of issues. She says, my 88-year-old mother-in-law has asthma and heart condition and wants to go to her grandchild's wedding. They will have 200 plus wedding guests in October in Missouri. The father of the bride is recovering from COVID and says the mother-in-law has the right to make this decision if she wants to go. Any suggestions on how to protect the mother-in-law and not hurt people's feelings?
Well, what I would say, Regina, is number one, I'm glad that you're concerned for your mother-in-law. Not everyone is concerned for their mother-in-law. And I don't mean that as a joke. I mean that literally. But I think that, your mother-in-law, if she's really a sound mind, she has a right to make this decision. But I think you also have the right to express your concerns, and that to express those concerns not in a kind of scolding way, but in a loving way. And that I think that your mother-in-law can, if she is agreeable to wearing a mask, if she's agreeable to washing her hands, she will certainly decrease the risk of contracting the infection. And so you could these won't come as new suggestions for her, so you can suggest them to her. But sometimes people may be more comfortable wearing a face shield than wearing a mask, and so you can make these suggestions and then but allow her to make her own decision. And I'm not sure there's more we can do than that.
Yeah, you talked about the tenets of Alcoholics Anonymous earlier, and one that's always stuck with me is that you can't work someone else's program for them. And at some point, even with my own parents, I try to convince them to not go to the grocery store, have it delivered, do the drive up and pick up, all of that. But at some point I have to realize my parents are grown adults and I just can't control them the way that you want to. And, you can tell them all why this is dangerous, all of that, hope that they take all the best precautions. But at some point you just have to let go and say, they're going to do what they're going to do. Got another question here from Serena. She says, I'm a volunteer who provides entertainment for many people in the long-term care communities. Do you have any suggestions about what I can do to continue cheering their lives?
Serena, good for you. That sounds like a wonderful thing for you to do. Obviously, folks who are in long-term care facilities, many of those, I would say most of those facilities are still locked down. So you'd have to work with the facility staff about what you might be able to do remotely. There are folks, honestly, that their loved ones pulled them out of long-term care facilities at the beginning of the pandemic, and they're at home, and maybe there's something that you can do for them at home. But I think that I think it's, even if you can't be in the same room with them, you can continue cheering them, because with whatever entertainment you do, because I think it's a nice, very important thing to do, and many of these folks want the company and need the cheer. So good for you.
Yeah, and Regina says that she really likes your face mask idea, Barry. She thinks that's a great idea. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are at 11:30, and we promised that we would keep it to 11:30 for you. So we want to thank Barry so much. Barry, thank you so much for sharing your morning with us, sharing your expertise. We really, really appreciate you joining us again this year for our conference. You are one of our favorite folks in the whole world. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Rob. Good luck, everybody.
I also want to follow up on what Barry had said about that caregiving is a marathon, not a sprint. I love that analogy so much, and especially where Barry talked about the fact that if you're going to be a runner, if you're going to run this marathon, you do smart things like you go check out the course, which leads to learning all you can about caregiving. So we have got a lot of great upcoming sessions that will be virtual later this year on caregiving. We have some caregiving workshops coming up in both October and November. We also, of course, have tomorrow and Thursday sessions with the Williamson County Caregiver Conference. So we invite you to take advantage of all of those. Number one, they're absolutely free. Number two, they are experts who are sharing their information with you. Also, remember, as always, anytime that you need us, Age of Central Texas is here to help you on your journey, no matter where you are, how many times your journey changes. That's why we exist. And as Barry said, there is never, ever any shame in asking for help, and especially when it's there for you for free. So we thank you for joining us today. We hope that we see you tomorrow with Michael Gill talking about long-term care communities here in Central Texas. And then again on Thursday, Rob Colgate's going to do some great activities with us on how we can use writing to help us in our caregiving journey. Barry, again, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today, and we will see you hopefully again tomorrow.